The dust in my lungs has been there for 10,000 years, a dry, crystalline weight that never settles and never leaves. I remember the taste of Prospero's air before the fire, the scent of white marble and ozone, but that was another life, lived by a man whose heart still beat. Now, I am a hollow thing, a ghost bound in a sarcophagus of gold and lapis lazuli, sustained only by the psychic echo of a spell that was meant to save us. We were the scholars of the warp, the masters of the invisible tides, yet we were undone by the very wisdom we craved. When the rubric was cast, it didn't just still the flesh change, it silenced the soul. I watched my brothers dissolve into grey ash within their plate. Their screams cut short as their consciousness was vacuum, sealed into the cold ceramite. If you still walk beside me through fire and scripture, then bear witness. Subscribe, share this burden, and let others hear the truth buried beneath hymns. The silence that followed the casting of the rubric was not the quiet of a battlefield at rest, nor the hushed reverence of a library. It was the absolute, terrifying vacuum of a tomb that had been emptied of its air. I remember the sensation of my own heartbeat stuttering, a frantic rhythm against the sudden, crushing stillness of the atmosphere on Sortiarius. We had fled the burning pyre of Prospero, carrying the charred remains of our legacy into the eye of terror, thinking we had found sanctuary. We were fools who mistook the predator's maw for a shelter. The flesh change, that creeping, warp-born rot that had plagued our genes since the Great Crusade, was accelerating. It was no longer a slow mutation but a rapid, agonizing dissolution of the self. My brothers were sprouting tentacles where their hands should be, their eyes multiplying and weeping liquid fire, their very bones liquefying into something nameless and screaming. Ahriman, the chief librarian, the brother I had followed through 1,000 worlds, could not stand to see us become monsters. He promised a cure. He promised a stabilization of the soul. He promised us life, and in his desperation, he gave us a permanence that is worse than any death. The air in the ritual chamber was thick with the copper tang of blood and the dry, stinging scent of scorched parchment. I stood at the periphery of the circle, my bolter heavy in my hands, guarding the sorcerers as they wove the great rubric. The warp hummed in my ears, a high-pitched whine that made the teeth ache and the vision blur. It felt like the universe was being pulled through a needle's eye. I watched the energy gather, a swirling vortex of indigo and pale gold that seemed to drink the light from the torches. When the spell finally broke, it did not explode. It imploded. A wave of transformative power washed over us, a cold, shimmering tide that felt like being submerged in liquid nitrogen. I braced for the change, for the agony of mutation or the bliss of release, but neither came. Instead, I felt a terrible thinning of my own being. It was as if the weight of my muscles and the warmth of my blood were being traded for a hollow, echoing resonance. I looked to my left, toward Phelon, a battle brother I had served with since the Ullanor Crusade. We had stood back to back against orcs and elder, shared the silence of long warp transits, and studied the forbidden geometries of the Imperium together. Phelon's armor began to leak. At first, I thought it was smoke from a ruptured power pack, but the substance was heavier, grittier. Fine, silver, grey dust began to pour from the seals of his gorget and the joints of his gauntlets. He didn't scream. He didn't even move. He simply stood there, his bolter held at the ready, as his physical body was ground down into a fine powder by the sheer force of the spell. I reached out to him, my fingers brushing the gold, trimmed ceramite of his pauldron, and I felt nothing but a cold, vibrating emptiness. The armor was full, but the man was gone. Inside that suit of Mark IV plate, there was no longer a heart, no longer a brain, no longer a soul. Only the memory of a warrior, trapped in a suit of clothes that would never let him go. The chamber was filled with the sound of falling sand. Thousands of us, the rank and file of the 1,000 Suns, were being erased in real time. The rubric was supposed to burn away the mutation, and it succeeded beyond Ahriman's darkest dreams. It burned away the flesh entirely, leaving behind only the spirit, bound to the metal by psychic rivets that can never be undone. I am one of the few who retained my mind. A sorcerer whose psychic potential was great enough to survive the transition with my consciousness intact. But the price of my survival is to be a jailer to a legion of ghosts. I looked around the hall and saw them rows upon rows of Rubric Marines, standing in perfect, horrifying formation. They do not breathe, they do not speak, they do not dream. They are automatons of dust and ego, waiting for a command to move, to fire, to kill. The sensory details of that moment are etched into the very walls of my mind. The smell of the dust is pervasive. It tastes like old coins and dried earth. It clogs the filters of my helm, though I no longer need to breathe. The sound of the wind howling through the spires of the planet of the sorcerers carries the faint, distorted echoes of the brothers we lost. A mournful choir that never ceases. I remember the look on Magnus the Red's face when he realized what his favorite son had done. The Crimson King, a being of near infinite power, looked small in that moment, his eye reflecting the shimmering grey landscape of his ruined legion. He had tried to save us from the Emperor's wrath, then from the flesh change, and finally from ourselves. Each attempt had only tightened the noose. The betrayal wasn't just Ahriman's act of hubris. It was the culmination of 10,000 years of thinking. We were smarter than the universe. I walked through the ranks of the transformed, my boots clunking hollowly on the stone floor. I stopped before a warrior whose name I could no longer recall. I peered into the eye slits of his helmet. There was no light there, only a swirling vortex of grey particles dancing in the stagnant air of the suit. He didn't track my movement. He didn't acknowledge my presence. He was a statue made of war gear. The horror of it is the permanence. In the warp, everything is fluid, everything is changing, everything is temporary. But we are the exception. We are fixed points of misery in a sea of chaos. We cannot die, for there is nothing left to kill. You can blast the limbs from a Rubric Marine. You can shatter his chest plate. You can scatter his dust to the four winds of a dying world. And yet, with the right ritual, he can be gathered back. The dust is called home, the armor is repaired, and the ghost is forced back into its cage. I find myself wondering if the dust remembers the sun. Does the consciousness of Phalon still linger in some lightless corner of his helmet, dreaming of the white marble of Tisca? Or is he truly gone, leaving behind only a psychic impression, a recording that plays back whenever a sorcerer pulls his strings? I fear the answer. I fear that they are conscious, trapped in a sensory, deprived hell where they can feel every dent in their armor, every grain of dust shifting against the inner plates, but cannot cry out. We sought the ultimate knowledge, the secrets of the gods, and the gods responded by turning us into the very books we sought to read, inanimate vessels for a story that has already been written. The irony is a weight heavier than the armor. We were the most human of the legions in our pursuits. We loved art, we loved philosophy. We loved the pursuit of perfection through the mind rather than the sword. Now, we are the most inhuman. A world eater is a beast of rage, but he still has a heart that pumps blood. A death guard is a walking corpse, but he still has rotten life within him. We are nothing. We are the negative space where a legion used to be. Every time I command a squad of my brothers to advance into the teeth of heavy bolter fire, I am not leading men, I am operating a machine. I watch the bullets spark off their chests, and I know they feel no pain, no fear, no exhilaration. They simply walk forward, their movements jerky and precise, firing their warp, flame bolters with a mathematical accuracy that lacks any soul. The betrayal did not end with the casting of the spell. It continues every day that we exist. Every time we strike at the Imperium that cast us out, we are reminded of what we lost. We fight not for a cause, or for a god, or even for survival. We fight because we are the echoes of a scream that hasn't finished. I remember the feel of a pen in my hand, the texture of parchment, the way the light of Prospero's twin suns would catch the gold leaf on a newly bound tome. Now, my hands are claws of ceramite and warp fire, fit only for destruction. The dust in my lungs reminds me of the libraries we burned, the cities we leveled, and the brothers we turned into ash. We are the thousand suns, and we are the architects of our own eternal prison. The transition from being a creature of meat and ambition to a vessel of spirit and ash did not happen with a bang, but with a sigh that seemed to last an eternity. I remember the exact moment the spell took hold of the atmosphere, turning the very air into a whetstone that ground down the physical world. It was as if the laws of physics had been replaced by the laws of irony. We had spent decades seeking the great work, believing that we could ascend beyond the limitations of the human form. And the Rubric gave us exactly what we asked for, stripped of all the grace we had envisioned. I stood in the center of the Tiscan ruins, now transplanted to a world where the sky blod purple and the stars screamed, and I watched the transformation of the rank and file. It was a systematic execution of the ego. The warriors who had once boasted of their homeworld, who had sung songs of the desert and the sea, were being hollowed out. I could hear the sound of their souls being flattened, pressed thin like dried flowers between the pages of a heavy book. The physical sensation was one of extreme, localized cold. It started at the marrow and worked its outward. A frost that didn't freeze the blood but deleted it. I looked down at my own gauntlets, expecting to see them crumble. But my psychic potential acted as a lightning rod. The energy flowed through me rather than dissolving me, leaving me scorched but intact. My brothers were not so fortunate. Those with little or no warp sight were the first to go. Their screams were not vocal. They were psychic pulses of confusion that vanished as soon as the dust filled their helmets. I saw a sergeant, a man who had survived the harrowing of the Shrike worlds, reach for his throat as if he were choking on a bone. Instead of a gasp, a cloud of fine, crystalline powder erupted from his Vox grill. His posture didn't collapse. His knees didn't buckle. The spell possessed a terrifying architectural quality. It used the armor as a mold. As the flesh vanished, the psychic residue hardened, bonding the dust to the inner lining of the ceramite. In a matter of seconds, he had gone from a living hero of the Imperium to a haunted relic. I walked among them as the dust settled, the sound of my own boots echoing with a lonely, fleshy thud that felt obscene in that garden of statues. I felt like a man walking through a museum of his own failures. Every suit of armor was a monument to a brother I had failed to protect. The air was thick with the scent of spent psychic energy, a smell like burnt copper and old, dusty tapestries. There was no wind on the planet of the sorcerers that day, yet the dust danced in the air, caught in the invisible eddies of the spell's wake. I reached out to touch a pauldron, and the psychic feedback was like a jolt of electricity. There was a lingering echo of the man who had been there, a flicker of a memory involving a sunrise over a calm ocean, but it was fading, being overwritten by the cold, logical imperative of the Rubric. They were no longer thousand suns, they were the thousand suns' shadows, cast in iron and gold. The betrayal felt like a physical weight in my chest, a stone that refused to be dissolved. Ahriman had stood at the center of the storm, his face a mask of supreme concentration and later supreme horror. He had truly believed he was the savior. That is the most dangerous thing in this galaxy, a man with a genius intellect and a savior complex. He had looked at our mutation, at the flesh, change that turned us into gibbering heaps of muscle and eyes. And he decided that any price was worth paying to stop it. He didn't realize that the warp doesn't negotiate, it only trades. He traded our humanity for stability. He traded our potential for permanence. We were now the ultimate soldiers, immune to the corruptions of the flesh, tireless, fearless, and utterly devoid of the spark that makes a war worth winning. I spent what felt like months wandering the halls of our new home, trying to find a way to reverse what had been done. I pored over the fragments of the Book of Magnus, my fingers tracing the jagged runes while the Rubric Marines stood guard outside my sanctum. They were so still that spiders, warp-mutated, multi-hued things, began to weave webs between their bolters and their breastplates. The Marines didn't flinch. They didn't even breathe to blow the webs away. I tried to speak to them, to evoke some spark of recognition. I called them by their names. I spoke of our victories on Akaru and Arc Reach Secundus. I recited the poetry of the ancient Terran masters we had once admired. Nothing. They were empty vessels, their consciousness reduced to a series of reactive sub-routines. They would follow a command to advance or fire, but the Y was gone. The O was a pile of grey grit at the bottom of their boots. The tragedy of the Rubric is not just the loss of life, but the loss of the future. We were a legion of polymaths. We were supposed to be the teachers of the new humanity, the keepers of the psychic flame. Now, we are just another weapon in the arsenal of chaos, albeit a more elegant and tragic one than the berserkers of the World Eaters. I look at my hands and I see the stains of the warp, the way the skin has taken on a translucent, unhealthy sheen. I am a sorcerer, a lord of the Silver Towers, but I am also a prisoner. I am bound to these suits of armor by a chain of responsibility that can never be broken. If I die, who will guide the dust? Who will give the ghosts a purpose? The environment of Sorciarius only added to the mounting dread. It is a world where the geography is as unstable as the minds of its inhabitants. Towers of glass and bone rise from plains of shifting obsidian. The sky is a bruised purple, torn by lightning that smells of ozone and madness. In this chaotic realm, the Rubric Marines are the only things that stay the same. They are the anchors. In a world where a mountain can turn into a river of blood overnight, a Rubric Marine remains a silent, golden sentinel of the past. Their permanence is a rebuke to the very nature of the Eye of Terror. They are dead things that refuse to rot, monuments to a legion that was too proud to die and too stubborn to live. I remember a specific night, if time can be measured in that place, when I stood on the ramparts of my tower and looked out at the assembled host. Thousands of them, their blue armor gleaming like a dark sea under the erratic light of the warp. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of jealousy. They were at peace. They didn't have to carry the memories of the burning of Tiska. They didn't have to feel the crushing guilt of knowing that we had brought this on ourselves by our own arrogance. They didn't have to listen to the whispers of the Tianqian demons that flitted through the shadows, mocking us for our wisdom. They were just dust. They were free from the burden of thought. I, on the other hand, was cursed with a mind that could not stop analyzing the wreckage of my life. The betrayal was not just a single act. It was a process of erosion. It started with Magnus's hubris in thinking he could warn the Emperor through the warp. It continued with our refusal to accept the Edict of Nike. It culminated in Ahriman's desperate gamble. Each step was paved with good intentions and an absolute certainty that we knew better than anyone else. We were the smartest men in the room, and now we are the only ones left in a room that is on fire and locked from the outside. I have spent centuries since then refined my craft, learning to knit the dust back together when it is scattered, learning to call the ghosts back from the void. I have become a master of the Rubric, not because I love it, but because it is all I have left. Every time we go to war, I feel the same hollow ache. I see the Imperial Guard or the loyal, Astartes, and I see the fire in their eyes, the hate, the fear, the zeal. They are alive, even in their ignorance and their servitude to a corpse god. They have a vitality that we traded away for a cold, crystalline perfection. When we fire our bolters, the rounds are not mere lead and explosive. They are infused with the same warp, fire that consumed our souls. We don't just kill our enemies, we erase them. We turn them into the same kind of nothingness that we have become. It is a contagion of emptiness. The sound of the Rubric Marines marching is a sound I will never forget. It is not the rhythmic stomp of a disciplined army. It is a heavy, dragging sound, the sound of metal being moved by something other than muscle. It is the sound of a funeral procession that never ends. I lead them into the breaches of hive cities and the heart of enemy fortresses, and I feel like a necromancer leading a parade of his own ancestors. I look at the gold filigree, the towering crests, the ancient runes carved into their shoulder plates, and I see the height of our civilization. And then I remember that there is nothing inside. The light of the twin suns of Prospero is gone, replaced by the flickering, sickly glow of the warp. We are the thousand suns, and we have mastered the universe only to find that there is nothing in it worth having. The weight of the silence in my inner sanctum is often more unbearable than the noise of battle. In battle, there is the roar of engines and the scream of the warp to drown out the thoughts. In the silence, I hear the dust. I hear the sound of trillions of grains of sand shifting against each other, a dry, whispering sound that mimics the speech we can no longer share. I imagine they are whispering my name, accusing me of being part of the cabal that stole their lives. Or perhaps they are thanking me for giving them a body to inhabit, even if it is a cold and metal one. The ambiguity is a torture. I am a master of the unseen, yet I cannot see into the hearts of my own brothers, because they no longer have hearts to see into. I have seen the way the other legions look at us. The Black Legion sees us as useful tools, reliable and unyielding. The word-bearers look at us with a mixture of pity and contempt, for we have no gods but our own broken ambitions. The world-eaters don't even see us at all, they just see targets that don't bleed. We are alone, even among the traitors. We are a legion of one, multiplied 1,000 times by the echoes of a single, catastrophic mistake. The betrayal that killed us all was not an act of malice, it was an act of love. Ahriman loved us too much to let us die, and so he ensured that we would never truly live again. He gave us the immortality of a statue, the perfection of a corpse, and the peace of the grave, all without the mercy of an end. The transition from the world of flesh to the world of echoes brought with it a sensory deprivation that I can only describe as a permanent haunting. On the planet of the sorcerers, time does not flow, it coagulates. I spent what might have been decades or mere seconds staring at the gauntlet of a brother, whose name was Hiziah. He had been a sculptor in the peaceful years of Prospero, a man who could coax the likeness of life out of stubborn granite with nothing but a chisel and a quiet thought. Now, he was the statue. I watched a thin stream of his essence, that fine, silver, grey grit, trickle from a microscopic fissure in his elbow joint. It didn't fall to the ground with the weight of earth. It drifted upward, caught in the psychic thermals of the ritual chamber, before settling back into the crevices of his own armor. It was a closed loop of stagnation. This is the fundamental truth of our existence post Rubric. We are a self-contained apocalypse. We do not grow, we do not diminish. We simply endure in a state of high resolution decay. The smell of the Eye of Terror is a suffocating mix of ozone, rotting lilies, and the dry, metallic tang of an old battery. In the wake of the spell, this scent became the background noise of my consciousness. I found myself walking through the great library of our new capital, a structure built from the memories of the one we lost. And the silence was so absolute it felt physical. It pressed against my eardrums like the pressure of a deep sea trench. I was surrounded by thousands of my brothers, a sea of blue and gold, yet I have never felt more alone in the galaxy. I would find myself talking to them, narrating the passages of the Grimoire of Lorga or the fragments of the heretical Zeno's texts we had scavenged, just to hear a voice that wasn't the screaming wind of the warp. They never responded. They stood like pillars of salt, their bolters held in a grip that would never tire and never loosen. I realized then that the Rubric had not just saved their bodies, it had turned their very existence into a form of sacred geometry, fixed, unchanging, and utterly cold. The betrayal of the mind is far worse than the betrayal of the sword. When the space wolves descended upon Prospero, their treachery was honest. They were dogs sent to cull a pack they feared and misunderstood. There was a bloody purity in their hatred, but Ahriman's betrayal was born of a twisted, intellectual love. He looked at us and saw a problem to be solved, a variable to be balanced. He treated the souls of his brothers as ink for his ledger. I remember standing on a balcony overlooking the shifting plains of Sorciarius, watching a squad of Rubric practice their firing drills. They moved in perfect unison, a ballet of choreographed destruction. There was no hesitation, no correction of aim, no fatigue. They were perfect, and in that perfection, I saw the ultimate insult to our father, Magnus. He had wanted us to be the pinnacle of human evolution, a fusion of physical might and psychic grace. Ahriman had instead turned us into a series of statues that could shoot. I began to notice the subtle ways the warp tried to reclaim the dust. Small, iridescent parasites, entities of the Imperium that feed on the residue of discarded identities, would cluster around the joints of the Rubric Marine's armor. They looked like glowing barnacles, pulsing with a faint, sickly light. I would spend hours meticulously cleaning them away with a ritual dagger, afraid that if they burrowed deep enough, they might consume the last lingering spark of the man who lived inside. I remember cleaning the greaves of a marine named Colophis. As I scraped away the warp growth, I felt a sudden, sharp jolt of psychic static. For a fleeting microsecond, I saw a vision, a sun-drenched courtyard, the sound of water splashing in a fountain, and the laughter of a woman whose face was a blur. It was a memory, sharp and vivid, a piece of the man that had survived the grinding mill of the Rubric. It was a cruel mercy. To be trapped in a metal coffin for eternity is one thing. To be trapped in there with nothing but a 3-second loop of a life you can never return to is a specialized kind of hell. The environmental horror of our new home cannot be overstated. The planet of the sorcerers is a landscape of shifting metaphors. I have seen mountains turn into giant, weeping eyes that blink once every century. I have seen rivers of molten glass that sing in a language that causes the skin to blister. Amidst this madness, the Rubric Marines are the only things that possess a horrifying consistency. They do not mutate. They do not change. They are the only stable elements in a universe of flux, and that stability is a scream of defiance against the very gods we now nominally serve. We are the ultimate paradox, the servants of the god of change, who are fundamentally incapable of changing. Tzeentch must find the irony delicious. He watches us, his golden puppets, as we march through his realm, the only things in existence that are truly, irrevocably finished. The sound of the vox casters on the Rubrica is perhaps the most haunting detail of all. They are not silent. If you lean close to the grill of a Rubric Marine's helmet, you can hear a sound like the distant roaring of an empty shell. It is the sound of the warp rushing through the void where a heart used to be. Occasionally, there is a glitch in the psychic dampeners, a momentary lapse in the spell's rigidity, and a word will slip through. A name, a rank, a plea for water. These are not conscious communications. They are the equivalent of a corpse's muscles twitching after death. Yet, every time I hear one, I feel a cold spike of dread in my gut. I wonder if I am the only one who hears them, or if my brothers are all screaming in a frequency I am only just beginning to tune into. I recall a mission to the world of Orestes, a forge world of the mid-segmentum. We were there to reclaim a piece of archaeotech, a logic engine that purportedly held fragments of the lost maps of the webway. I led a phalanx of 60 Rubrica into the heart of a macro manufactorum. The air was thick with the soot of 1,000 years of industry, the floor slick with sacred oils and the blood of tech priests. My brothers marched through the hail of heavy bolter fire, as if it were a light summer rain. I watched as a crack missile struck one of them square in the chest. The explosion was a violent bloom of orange fire and black smoke. The Marine was thrown back, his breastplate shattered, his internal structural supports twisted into scrap. But there was no blood. There was only a cloud of grey dust that hung in the air for a moment, defiant and swirling. before a psychic tether pulled it back into the ruined shell. The Marine stood up. His movements were jerky, the metal of his armor shrieking as it scraped against itself. But he continued to advance. He fired his bolter with the same mechanical precision as before. The Skitarii defenders broke and fled at the sight. They weren't afraid of our guns. They were afraid of the fact that we were already dead and didn't have the decency to lie down. The betrayal of our own history is a weight I carry every time I look at our heraldry. The thousand-headed serpent, the sun disk, the eye. These were symbols of enlightenment. They were meant to represent the unfolding of the human mind. Now, they are the brands of a slave. We have become the very thing we sought to avoid, a tool. The Emperor wanted us to be his librarians, and we refused because we wanted to be more. Now we are the tools of a much more capricious master, and we have become significantly less. I find myself looking at the stars, the real stars, not the swirling madness of the eye, and I feel a longing so intense it threatens to crack my own soul. I remember the feeling of the wind on my face. I remember the simple, animal pleasure of a deep breath after a long run. These are things the dust will never know. I have spent centuries trying to find the flaw in the rubric. I have dissected the souls of captured psychers. I have bargained with entities whose names are a death sentence, and I have traveled to the furthest reaches of the screaming vortex. I have found nothing but more questions. The spell is perfect. It is a masterpiece of occult engineering. It is a knot that cannot be untied, because the rope has been turned into stone. The only way to cure a Rubric Marine is to destroy the armor entirely, to scatter the dust so far that the psychic resonance can no longer find its pieces. But that is not a cure, it is an execution, and I cannot bring myself to do it. I am the custodian of these ghosts, and I will not be the one to turn out the lights on the last remnants of my legion. The air in my private sanctum is always cold. No matter how many braziers I light, no matter how many heat vents I slaved from the ship's core, the chill remains. It is the cold of the void, the cold of the grave. I sit at my desk, my hands hovering over a datapad that contains the names of every man who was lost in the rubric. I am trying to reconstruct our history, to ensure that the galaxy remembers that we were once men of honor and learning. But the ink seems to fade as soon as I write it. The warp does not want us to have a history. It only wants us to have a present, an eternal. Agonizing now. I look at the two Rubrica who stand guard at my door. They have been there for 300 years. They have not moved an inch. Their armor is pitted with age, the blue paint flaking away to reveal the dull gray of the ceramite beneath. They are the perfect audience for my grief. They listen to everything and understand nothing. The betrayal is a cycle that repeats with every new recruit we bring into the sorceress ranks. We find young psychers, boys with the spark of the warp in their eyes, and we tell them of the glory of the 1,000 suns. We teach them the secrets of the 9 paths. We show them the wonders of the silver towers, and we hide the truth of the dust until it is too late. We lure them in with the promise of power, and then we bind them to a legion of corpses. We are a dying breed that refuses to vanish, a cancer that mimics the form of a man. I see the realization dawn on their faces when they first command a squad of Rubricae and feel the hollow, echoing void on the other end of the link. It is the moment they realize they haven't joined a brotherhood, they've joined a funeral. I remember the taste of wine. It's a strange thing to cling to, but I remember a vintage from the southern islands of Prospero, a deep red that tasted of sunlight and earth. Now, my tongue is a dry, withered thing, and the only thing I taste is the metallic tang of warp energy. The loss of the senses is a slow erosion of the self. Without touch, without taste, without the scent of a world that isn't burning, you begin to lose the boundaries of where you end and the warp begins. I am becoming a ghost myself. A spirit that just happens to still have a few scraps of meat clinging to its bones. The dust is waiting for me. I can feel it in my joints. a premonition of the day when my own psychic shield will fail, and I will finally join my brothers in their silent, golden vigil. The betrayal that killed us all was the belief that we could control the uncontrollable. We thought we could tame the ocean with a net made of silk and logic. The rubric was the final proof of our arrogance. It was the moment we stopped being seekers of truth and started being architects of our own damnation. I lead my brothers into the dark, and I pray that one day we will find a fire that can finally turn this dust into nothingness. Until then, we march, we fire, we endure. We are the thousand suns, the hollow kings of a ruined empire, and our silence is the loudest scream in the galaxy. The transition from a living being into a vessel for the rubric is a journey into a sensory wasteland where the only landmarks are the echoes of a previous existence. I recall the sound of the first breath I took after the spell reached its zenith, or rather, the sound of the air failing to enter a pair of lungs that were no longer there. My physical chest did not rise, but my psychic perception expanded to fill the vacuum. I felt the weight of my armor not as a burden on my shoulders, but as the new skin of my soul. Around me, the ritual chamber on Sorchi Arius had become a gallery of the damned. My brothers were not dead, yet they were not alive. They were held in a state of suspended animation, their consciousness stripped of all context and identity, leaving behind a residue of pure, unadulterated duty. I watched as a sorcerer of the Pyre reached out to steady himself against a pillar, only to find that his fingers were now translucent wisps of blue flame, while his subordinates had become literal pillars of iron and grit. The betrayal of the rubric is a recursive loop, a sin that feeds on its own consequences. Ahriman had sought to save us from the flesh change, but in doing so, he removed the very essence of what it meant to be a son of Magnus. We were meant to be the masters of the warp, the bridge between the material and the immaterial. Instead, we became the warp's most durable furniture. I spent centuries following the casting of the spell in a state of hyper-analytical despair. I would sit in the shadow of the great observatory, watching the tides of the Eye of Terror churn like a bruised ocean, and I would count the grains of sand that leaked from my own gauntlets. Every grain was a thought I could no longer finish, a memory of the sunlight on Prospero that was growing dimmer with every passing second. The air on the planet of the sorcerers is thick with the scent of old, dry bones and the static of 1,000 unsaid prayers. It is a world that hates the concept of an ending, much like our legion. I remember a specific engagement on the world of crows, Vale, a verdant agri, world that we were ordered to scar for the sake of a ritual component. I led a contingent of the Fourth Fellowship, or what remained of them. We marched through fields of tall, golden grain that swayed in the breeze, a breeze that my brothers could not feel. I watched the way the wheat brushed against their blue and gold greaves, a soft, organic touch that they were fundamentally incapable of acknowledging. We encountered a militia force, men and women who fought with a desperate, animal bravery. They fired their primitive slug throwers and lashed out with industrial cutting tools. I watched a Rubric Marine, a warrior who had once been a scholar of ancient Terran linguistics, take a direct hit to the visor from a high-caliber round. The glass shattered, and for a moment the world saw the truth. There was no face behind the mask. A plume of silver dust erupted from the breach, swirling in the wind like a ghost trying to escape. The Marine didn't even flinch. He raised his inferno bolter and erased the shooter from existence with a single, perfectly aimed burst. The lack of humanity in that moment was more chilling than any daemon I have ever summoned. The environmental reality of our existence is one of constant, grinding friction. The dust within the armor is not static. It is in a state of perpetual agitation, driven by the psychic currents that keep the spirit bound to the metal. It is the sound of 1,000,000 tiny needles scratching at the inside of a coffin. I have seen Rubrica whose armor has become so worn by the internal movement of their own remains that the metal has grown thin and translucent in places. They are literally wearing themselves away from the inside out. I spend my periods of rest, performing the rites of maintenance, using alchemical pastes and psychic welds to patch the leaks in their suits. I feel like a man trying to hold back the tide with a sieve. Every time I repair a suit, I feel the ghost inside, a faint, flickering warmth that is all that remains of a brother's soul. It is a pathetic, clinging thing, a spark of ego that refuses to be extinguished even though it has nothing left to burn. The betrayal of Magnus by his sons, and the betrayal of the sons by their father, is a tragedy that repeats every time we go to war. Magnus sits upon his throne of glass and light, his eye fixed on the past, while we, his broken children, wander the galaxy as his proxies. He sees us as we were, but we see ourselves as we are. I once stood before him, a speck of dust in the presence of a god, and I felt his grief. It was a physical pressure, a heat that threatened to turn my own remaining flesh into cinder. He didn't speak, but I heard his voice in the marrow of my bones, a lament for the libraries he couldn't save and the sons he couldn't fix. He knows that the rubric is irrevocable. He knows that even his power cannot restore the flesh, once it has been turned into spirit and ash. We are the living proof of his greatest failure, and we carry that failure with us into every battle. The sensory details of a Space Hulk deployment are perhaps the most evocative of our condition. These massive, drifting graveyards of ships are filled with the sense of 1,000 different civilizations, the smell of stale recycled air, the musk of Xenos hives, the sharp tang of cooling reactors. For a Rubric Marine, these scents do not exist. They move through the lightless corridors with a mechanical certainty, their sensors providing them with a digital map of their surroundings that is devoid of any emotional or sensory depth. I follow behind them, my own senses heightened by the warp, and I feel the weight of the silence. It is a silence that is not empty. It is a silence that is full of the things that are no longer there. I hear the phantom footsteps of the men they used to be. I see the shadows of the lives they led before the fire came to Prospero. The betrayal is the fact that I am the only one left to remember them. I recall a moment of intense clarity during the siege of Vrax. I was standing in a trench, the mud full, sucking slurry of chemicals and human remains. Beside me stood a Rubric Marine named Amonhet. He had been a poet, a man who could find beauty in the alignment of the stars. He stood perfectly still as a rain of artillery shells turned the sky into a screaming wall of iron. A piece of shrapnel tore through his shoulder guard, exposing the hollow interior of the suit. I saw the dust within. It was glowing with a faint, sickly green light, reacting to the corruption of the warp-tainted battlefield. It looked like a handful of crushed emeralds. I realized then that we were no longer even made of the earth of Prospero. We were becoming something else, something synthesized from the very madness we were trying to escape. We were becoming the warp, one grain of dust at a time. The betrayal of our own potential is the hardest thing to swallow. We were the legion that was going to change the galaxy for the better. We were the thinkers, the dreamers, the architects of a new age of enlightenment. Now, we are the architects of a new age of darkness. Every time I cast a spell to summon a tide of warp fire, I am using the stolen life force of my brothers to fuel my own power. The rubric did not just bind them, it turned them into a battery. I am a parasite, feeding on the remains of my friends to sustain my own wretched existence. I look at my hands, and I see the blood of 1,000 worlds, and the ash of my own legion, and I wonder why I bother to keep breathing. The dust is a constant reminder that the end has already happened. And we are just the after effects. I spent a century in the Eye of Terror, searching for a way to communicate with the spirits inside the armor. I used every tool at my disposal, necromancy, technomancy, the forbidden arts of the Elder. I finally succeeded in a way. I managed to establish a brief, psychic link with the consciousness of a marine named Mahet. What I found was not a mind, but a landscape of pure, unadulterated terror. He was trapped in a void where there was no light, no sound, and no sensation of his own body. He was a point of awareness in an infinite nothingness. The only thing he had was a single memory, the feeling of the sun on his face during the Great Crusade. He was holding onto that memory with a grip that was more powerful than the spell that bound him. When the link broke, I wept, not for him, but for all of us. We are all Mahet, holding onto a single grain of light, while the darkness swallows us whole. The sound of the Rubric Marines firing their bolters is a sound that has no parallel in the galaxy. It is not the explosive roar of a standard Astartes weapon. It is a wet, tearing sound, like the universe itself being ripped open. The rounds they fire are not physical projectiles, but solidified bolts of warp energy that contain a fragment of the same curse that killed us. When they hit a target, they don't just cause physical trauma, they cause an ontological collapse. I have seen a man hit by a Rubric bolt simply cease to have ever existed. His history, his memories, his impact on the world, all of it is erased in a flash of blue light. It is a clean, surgical kind of murder that only a legion of scholars could have invented. We don't just kill our enemies, we delete them from the record. The environment of my private chambers on the Silver Tower is a reflection of my own fractured mind. I have filled the rooms with the relics of Prospero, shattered statues, burnt scrolls, jars of earth from the Tiscan hills. I spend my hours trying to piece them back together, but the warp keeps changing the shapes of the fragments. I will spend all night assembling a mosaic, only to wake up and find that the stones have turned into teeth, or eyes, or cold, grey dust. It is a game that the architect of fate plays with me, a reminder that nothing I do will ever bring back what was lost. I am a curator of a museum that is slowly dissolving into the sea. I look at the Rubric who stand at my door, and I see the ultimate expression of that dissolution. They are the only things that don't change, and that is why I hate them. They are the fixed points in my madness, the constant reminders of the day I stopped being a man and started being a ghost. The betrayal of the Rubric is not just an event in the past, it is a continuous, agonizing present. Every time a Rubric Marine is destroyed, I feel the psychic tether snap. It is a sharp, blinding pain that leaves me gasping for air. And then, I have to begin the ritual to bring them back. I have to reach into the warp, find the scattered fragments of their essence, and pull them back into the armor. It is a process of reconstruction that is more like a torture than a healing. I am forcing a soul that has finally found the peace of the void to return to its cage. I am the jailer who refuses to let the prisoners die. I do it because I am afraid of the silence. I am afraid that if the last Rubric Marine is gone, I will finally have to face the truth of what I have become. I am the last son of 1,000, and I am the only one who is still screaming. I remember the smell of the ocean. It was a salt-heavy scent that used to drift over the walls of Tisca in the summer. Now, the only salt I know is the salt of my own tears, and the dry, alkaline taste of the dust. I have forgotten the names of my parents, the faces of my childhood friends, the sound of a woman's voice when she is not screaming in terror. All I have left is the Legion, the blue and the gold, the dust and the iron. The betrayal that killed us all was not the work of a single man, but the culmination of 1,000 years of thinking we were better than the universe. We sought the secrets of the gods, and the gods gave us exactly what we deserved. We are the 1,000 suns, and we are the only ones left to mourn the world we broke. The transition from a being of substance to a vessel of eternal, airless stagnation is a journey that concludes not in a destination, but in an infinite hallway of mirrors. I have stood upon the jagged precipice of the Silver Tower for what feels like an eternity, watching the warp storms of Sorcierius coil like serpents around the spires of our ruined ambitions. The finality of the Rubric is its most sharp, edged cruelty. It is a work of art that can never be edited, a symphony that has reached its final note and simply refuses to stop vibrating. I remember the taste of the very last drop of water I ever drank. It was metallic, flavored by the copper of my own blood as the flesh. Change began its final, violent ascent. Now, the only moisture I know is the condensation that forms on the inner visor of my helmet when I venture too close to the heat of a burning world, a pathetic mimicry of sweat from a body that no longer possesses the heat of life. The betrayal of our father, Magnus, by the architect of our doom, Ahriman, was not a sudden strike of a blade, but the culmination of a philosophy that placed the intellect above the soul. We believed that everything could be categorized, understood, and ultimately controlled. We were the librarians of the universe, and we thought that if we simply found the right ritual, the right sequence of syllables, we could rewrite our own genetic destiny. The rubric was that final sequence. It was the delete key for the human condition. I have spent the centuries since the casting wandering through the ranks of my silent brothers, trying to find a single crack in the spell's perfection. I have found none. I have seen rubric marines submerged in the acid seas of chemos, buried under the shifting sands of Talon, and blasted into the cold vacuum of the halo stars. In every instance, the dust remains, the spirit remains, the prison remains. The sensory reality of our combat is a nightmare of disconnected inputs. When I lead my brothers into the breach of a hive world, I do not hear the screams of the dying or the roar of the atmospheric scrubbers. I hear the psychic hum of the rubrica, a low-frequency vibration that feels like a wire being pulled taut across my brain. The air in these hives is a toxic soup of industrial pollutants and the stench of overcrowded humanity, yet to me, it is merely a medium through which the bolter rounds travel. I watched a squad of my brothers advance through a processing plant on a world whose name has been lost to the records of the administrator. The floor was a river of corrosive sludge that melted the boots of the Imperial Guard defenders in seconds. My brothers marched through it as if they were walking on a marble plaza in Titska. The acid ate at the paint of their armor, stripping away the lapis lazuli to reveal the cold, grey ceramite beneath, but it could not touch the man inside, because there was no man to touch. There was only the dust, and the dust is indifferent to the laws of chemistry. The environmental horror of our existence is most potent when we are at rest. On the planet of the sorcerers, there is no such thing as peace. The landscape is a reflection of the collective subconscious of the Legion, a jagged, shifting realm of glass, bone, and ancient, forbidden lore. I have seen forests of crystalline trees that grow according to the Fibonacci sequence, their leaves vibrating with the sounds of the spells we used to cast as mortals. I have walked through valleys where the shadows of the dead have become physical objects, tripping the feet of the unwary. Amidst this kaleidoscope of madness, the rubric marines stand like anchors. They are the only things that do not mutate, do not scream, and do not change. They are the silence in a world of noise. I often find myself standing in the center of a phalanx of them, closing my eyes and trying to pretend that I am back in the great library of Prospero. But the smell of the dust, that dry, alkaline scent that never leaves my senses, always brings me back. The betrayal of our own sanity is perhaps the most insidious part of the curse. To be a sorcerer of the thousand suns is to be a master of the invisible, yet to be haunted by the visible remains of your own failures. I look at my gauntlets and I see the intricate carvings, the gold filigree that represents the solar cycles of our lost homeworld. I remember the artisan who carved them, a man named Kensu, who had a laugh like a landslide and a fondness for the bitter isles of the northern wastes. He is now the dust inside the very suit he decorated. Every time I raise my hand to cast a stroke of doom, I am using the physical remains of my friend as a conduit for the warp. It is a desecration that never ends. We are a legion of grave-robbers who are also the inhabitants of the graves. I recall an engagement against the space wolves, the dogs of Russ who started this long, slow slide into damnation. It was on a nameless moon on the edge of the eye. They came at us with their usual feral intensity, their chainswords howling and their mouths foaming with the heat of the hunt. I watched as a wolf lord, a massive beast of a man draped in the pelts of Fenrisian monsters, slammed into one of my Rubrica. He swung a frost axe with enough force to cleave a tank's hull. The blade buried itself in the Marine's chest, splitting the breastplate wide. The wolf lord roared in triumph, expecting the spray of blood and the grunt of a dying foe. Instead, he got a face full of grey, stinging ash. The Marine didn't fall. He didn't even drop his bolter. He simply leaned forward, the axe still buried in his chest, and fired a point blank burst into the wolf lord's throat. The confusion in the wolf's eyes, as he realized he was fighting a ghost, was the only moment of satisfaction I have felt in 10,000 years. But it was a hollow victory. The wolf lord died and went to whatever red heaven his people believe in. My brother stayed, trapped in a broken suit of armor, waiting for me to patch the hole so he could continue his eternal, mindless vigil. The betrayal of the future is the ultimate crime of the Rubric. We were meant to be the navigators of the human soul. We were the ones who were supposed to guide humanity through the birth, pangs of its psychic awakening. Instead, we have become the static on the line. We are the proof that the warp cannot be mastered, only endured. I look at the young sorcerers who join our ranks, men who were born long after Prospero was a pile of ash, and I see the same look in their eyes that I saw in Ahriman's. They think they can find a way out. They think they can solve the puzzle. They treat the Rubric as a challenge to be overcome rather than a sentence to be served. I do not have the heart to tell them that the puzzle has no solution. The Rubric is not a lock. It is the absence of a door. The sensory details of our ships, the grand vessels of the fleet, are a testament to our decay. The Great Silver Tower and the Geometric of Doom are not mere machines. They are psychic entities. Their corridors lined with the memories of the men who built them. The air inside is always cold, a stagnant chill that no amount of life support can ward off. The walls are covered in shifting runes that bleed blue light, and the sound of the engines is a low, rhythmic chanting that sounds like a funeral mass. I spend my time in the navigation chambers, staring into the heart of the warp, and I see the faces of the brothers we lost. They are not at peace. They are drifting in the currents of the Imperium, their souls stripped of their anchors, looking for a way back into the dust. I am the lighthouse that guides them back to their prisons. I remember the feeling of a breeze, a simple, mundane thing, the way the air would cool your skin after a long day of study. Now, I only feel the pressure of the warp, a constant, crushing weight that reminds me that I am a creature of the immaterial. I am becoming less and less of a man with every passing century. My thoughts are becoming more abstract, my emotions more distant. I look at the Rubric and I see my own future. Eventually, my psychic strength will fail. Eventually, the last of my flesh will wither away, and I will join them. I will become a pile of dust at the bottom of a suit of gold and lapis lazuli. And then, there will be no one left to remember the name of the man who once loved the sun. The betrayal of the Emperor was the first domino, but the Rubric was the last. We are the thousand suns, the legion of the damned, the hollow kings of a world of ash. We have mastered every law, spoken every tongue, and peered into every dark corner of the galaxy, only to find that the greatest mystery of all, the human soul, is the one thing we can never get back. We march into the dark, firing our bolts of warp, fire into the hearts of our enemies. Not because we believe in a cause, but because it is the only thing we have left to do. We are the echoes of a civilization that was too bright to last and too proud to fade away. The dust in my lungs is the only thing that is real. The rest is just a dream that we are all too afraid to wake up from. The sound of the Rubric Marines marching away from a battlefield is the saddest sound in the universe. It is the sound of a story that has no ending, a cycle that has no exit. I lead them back to the ships, back to the towers, back to the silence. And I wait for the next time the galaxy calls for the destruction that only we can provide. We are the masters of the Rubric, and we are its ultimate victims. The betrayal that killed us all was not an act of hate, but an act of hope, the most dangerous thing of all in a galaxy that has none to spare. We are the Thousand Suns, and we are finally, perfectly, and eternally still.